Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we choose love over logic. In the frontier town of Millbrook, that moment came when Judge Crawford decided to auction off 12 orphaned children to the highest bidders. The wealthy men lined up like they were choosing livestock. The banker picked the prettiest girl. The merchant wanted the strongest boy. One by one, the children disappeared into new homes, until only little Sarah remained, small, frail, with hollow eyes that had seen too much sorrow. Thomas Kane, the mountain man everyone feared and few understood, stepped forward from the shadows. While others had chosen children who could work their fields or grace their parlors, Kane pointed to the girl nobody wanted. The crowd whispered and shook their heads. They thought he'd made a terrible mistake, but what they didn't know was why a man who'd lost everything would risk his heart on a child the world had already forgotten. Before we jump back in, and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Kane had built his cabin in the high country for one reason: to be alone with his ghosts. The structure stood like a fortress against the Montana wilderness, its thick log walls and reinforced shutters bearing testament to a man who understood the value of defensible positions. 20 years of military service had taught him to prepare for the worst. And the worst had already found him once before, the morning after the auction, as he guided his horse up the winding mountain trail with Sarah perched silently behind him. Kane wondered what demon had possessed him to point at that fragile child. Her arms circled his waist with desperate strength, as if she expected him to change his mind and deposit her back in town, like unwanted freight. "Almost home," he said quietly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Home. He'd stopped thinking of the cabin as anything more than shelter years ago. Sarah didn't respond. She hadn't spoken a single word since Judge Crawford had declared her placed and handed over the crude bill of sale. Kane had seen that hollow stare before, in the eyes of soldiers who'd witnessed too much, children caught in crossfire, survivors pulled from burning villages. The girl was somewhere far away, locked behind walls that might never come down. The cabin appeared through the pine trees like something from a fairy tale. Smoke curling from the stone chimney, windows glowing amber in the afternoon light. Kane had always kept it immaculate, military precise, every tool in its place, every corner swept clean. It was a refuge for one man's ordered solitude, not a home for a frightened child. He dismounted and reached up to help Sarah down, but she'd already slipped from the saddle, clutching a bundle of rags to her chest. As she stepped closer, Kane realized it wasn't just rags. It was a doll, sewn from scraps of fabric, with button eyes and yarn hair that had seen better decades. The thing looked like it had been through a war. "She's pretty," Kane said, nodding toward the doll. Sarah's grip tightened protectively, her first real reaction since leaving town. Her eyes darted between Kane and the cabin door, calculating distances, escape routes, planning. Smart girl. Kane opened the cabin door and stepped aside. "Go ahead, take a look around." Sarah hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing might trap her forever. Finally, she took one tentative step inside, then another. Kane followed, seeing his home through her eyes. The massive stone fireplace, hand-hewn furniture built to last generations, shelves lined with books he'd collected from a dozen countries. It was comfortable but austere, lacking any softness that might welcome a child. The girl moved like a shadow, examining everything without touching. She paused before a wooden trunk beneath the far window, her head tilted, as if listening to voices Kane couldn't hear. Inside that trunk lay folded uniforms, medals he'd never worn after leaving the service, letters from men who were probably dead now. Ghosts, all of them. "Are you hungry?" Kane asked. Sarah turned those hollow eyes toward him and nodded slightly. Progress. He moved to the kitchen area, conscious of her gaze tracking his every movement. From the cold box he retrieved bread, butter, and honey. Simple fare, but it was what he had. As he prepared the meal, he found himself talking, filling the silence that seemed to press against the cabin walls. "I built this place myself," he said, slicing bread with practiced efficiency. "Took most of a summer. Had to pack every board and nail up that mountain trail on horseback. He glanced over his shoulder. Sarah stood exactly where he'd left her, motionless. Previous owner was a trapper named McGillicuddy. Died of pneumonia one winter. Town folks said the place was cursed, which made it cheap. He spread honey on the bread, the golden sweetness reminding him of better times. McGillicuddy's ghost never bothered me much. Figure we both like the quiet. Sarah's stomach growled audibly, betraying her careful composure. Kane pretended not to notice as he set the plate on his small dining table and pulled out a chair. "Come eat," he said gently. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." She approached the table like a deer approaching a salt lick, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. When she finally sat, she kept the doll in her lap, one arm wrapped around it while she ate with her free hand. The bread disappeared quickly, and Kane cut another slice without comment. As evening approached, Kane realized he faced a problem he hadn't considered: sleeping arrangements. His cabin contained one room, one bed, and furniture sized for a man who'd grown accustomed to solitude. Sarah solved the dilemma herself by curling up in the corner beside the fireplace, using her bundle of spare clothes as a pillow. "There's a bed," Kane offered. She shook her head, clutching the doll tighter. Kane understood. Corners were defensible. Corners meant you couldn't be surrounded. He fetched his warmest blanket and laid it over her slight form, careful not to make contact. Sarah watched him through half-closed eyes, still alert, still ready. "Sleep well," he said, settling into his chair by the fire. "You're safe here." Whether she believed him or not remained to be seen, but Kane intended to prove it true. He'd chosen her for reasons he didn't fully understand yet, but he was a man who honored his commitments. Whatever had driven him to point at that unwanted child, he would see it through. As the fire burned low and Sarah's breathing finally evened into sleep, Kane reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. For years, he'd convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the pain of caring. Safer to love no one than to risk losing someone again. But looking at the small figure curled beside his fireplace, he wondered if perhaps isolation wasn't protection. It was just another kind of prison. Outside, the mountain wind whistled through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of winter. Inside, for the first time in years, Thomas Kane's cabin sheltered more than one heart. Whether that was wisdom or folly remained to be written in the days ahead. The doll watched from Sarah's arms with button eyes that held their own secrets, as if it too understood that some journeys begin with choices that make no sense to anyone but the heart that makes them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight it was enough that a frightened child slept safely by his fire, and that Thomas Kane had remembered what it felt like to be responsible for someone other than himself. The feeling was terrifying. The feeling was right. 3 weeks passed before Sarah spoke her first word to Thomas Kane, and when she did, it changed everything. Kane had established routines that seemed to comfort the girl. Breakfast at sunrise, chores in the morning, quiet time by the fire in the afternoon. She followed him like a shadow, watching as he split wood, mended harness, and prepared for the coming winter. Her doll never left her arms, a constant companion that seemed to give her strength. On this particular morning, Kane was teaching her to identify animal tracks in the soft earth near the creek, when Sarah suddenly stopped walking. She knelt beside a depression in the mud, her small finger tracing the outline of a boot print. "Papa," she whispered. Kane's heart clenched. The word hung in the cool mountain air like a prayer, but as he looked more closely at what had caught her attention, his blood ran cold. The boot print was fresh, made sometime during the night, and it didn't belong to him. "Sarah," he said quietly, "we need to go back to the cabin." Right now, something in his tone must have communicated the urgency, because she stood immediately, clutching her doll. They made their way back through the trees, Kane's hand resting on the grip of his Colt, eyes scanning the forest for movement. Inside the cabin, everything appeared normal, but Kane's military instincts screamed warnings. He checked the windows, the doorframe, looking for signs of tampering. Nothing obvious, but someone had been watching them. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me," Kane said, kneeling to her eye level. Remember that corner where you like to sleep? I want you to go there and stay very quiet while I look around outside." She nodded, understanding the seriousness without needing explanation. As she settled into her corner, Kane noticed she was doing something with her doll, her fingers working at a seam in the fabric. "What are you doing there, sweetheart?" Sarah looked up at him with those two knowing eyes. "Mama said if I ever felt scared, I should remember what she hid for me." Her small fingers found a hidden opening in the doll's back, and she withdrew something that made Kane's breath catch, a silver locket, tarnished with age, but clearly valuable. Sarah opened it with practiced ease, revealing a photograph inside. A man and woman standing before a modest ranch house, the woman holding a baby. "That's Mama and Papa," Sarah said simply. "And me when I was little." Kane took the locket with careful hands, studying the photograph. The man was tall and strong, with kind eyes and calloused hands. The woman was beautiful in a quiet way, holding her child with gentle confidence. But what struck Kane most was the house behind them. He recognized it, the Hartwell place. Burned to the ground 2 years ago, the family supposedly killed by raiders. But Sarah would have been 5 then, old enough to survive, old enough to remember. "Sarah," Kane said slowly, "what happened to your mama and papa?" Her small face crumpled, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then in a voice barely above a whisper she said, "The bad men came in the night. Papa tried to fight them, but there were too many. Mama hid me in the root cellar before they—" She stopped, unable to finish. Kane felt rage building in his chest like a wildfire. The Hartwell murders had been brutal, senseless. Everyone in town knew it, but Judge Crawford had declared the case closed after a cursory investigation. No suspects found, no justice served. "Do you remember anything about these bad men? What they looked like?" Sarah nodded. "One of them was the judge. He talked to Papa before they hurt him. Said Papa was stupid for not selling when he had the chance." The words hit Kane like a physical blow. Judge Crawford, the same man who had orchestrated yesterday's auction, who had made sure Sarah was placed last, unwanted, forgotten. "Sarah, this is very important. Did your mama tell you anything else before she hid you?" "She said if anything happened to them, I should find the papers Papa kept hidden. She said they proved the land was ours, and that bad people wanted to take it." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But when I went back later, everything was burned. I couldn't find anything." Kane studied the photograph again, his military mind analyzing details. In the background, barely visible, was a surveyor's marker, the kind used to establish property boundaries. If his memory was correct, the Hartwell Ranch sat on some of the most valuable grazing land in the territory land that Judge Crawford now controlled through a series of convenient tax sales and abandoned property acquisitions. The sound of approaching horses broke through his thoughts. Kane moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. 3 men on horseback were riding up his trail, moving with the casual arrogance of those who believed themselves untouchable. Kane recognized the leader, Deputy Marshal Briggs, Crawford's chief enforcer. The other 2 were hired guns, the kind of men who asked no questions as long as the pay was good. "Sarah, I need you to take your doll and hide in the root cellar beneath the kitchen," Kane said quietly. "No matter what you hear, don't come out until I call for you. Can you do that?" She nodded, fear and trust warring in her young face. Kane helped her lift the concealed trapdoor and watched as she disappeared into the small space below. He replaced the wooden cover and scattered a rug over it, just as boots sounded on his porch. The knock, when it came, was perfunctory. Briggs didn't wait for an invitation before pushing the door open. "Kane," the deputy said, touching the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. "Heard you adopted yourself a little girl." "Legal adoption," Kane replied evenly. "Papers are all in order. I'm sure they are. Judge Crawford is real particular about his paperwork." Briggs stepped inside without invitation, his eyes scanning the cabin. "Mind if we have a look around? Just making sure the child is being properly cared for." Kane didn't move from his position, blocking the center of the room. "By whose authority?" "Territory's authority. Can't have children living in unsafe conditions." Briggs smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Some folks in town are concerned about a little girl living way up here with a man like you. A man like me? You know, military background, history of violence. Some might say you're not suitable to raise a child." Kane felt his jaw tighten. "The judge found me suitable enough to approve the adoption." Well, judges sometimes make mistakes. They can be corrected. Briggs moved closer, and Kane caught the scent of whiskey on his breath. "Here's the thing, Kane. That little girl belongs in town, with a proper family. Folks with the means to give her a good education, nice clothes, all the things a growing child needs. She's fine where she is she? Awful isolated up here. What happens if she gets sick, gets hurt? Long way to town for help." Briggs's hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Of course, accidents happen to mountain men sometimes too. Hunting mishaps, falls, that sort of thing. Terrible shame when a child ends up orphaned twice." The threat was clear, and Kane felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the same focused calm that had kept him alive through 20 years of warfare. These men had come here to intimidate him into giving up Sarah, and they were prepared to use violence if necessary. But they didn't know about the locket. They didn't know that Sarah was more than just another unwanted orphan. She was a witness, a survivor, and quite possibly the rightful heir to land that Crawford had stolen through murder. "I appreciate your concern," Kane said mildly. "But Sarah stays with me." Briggs studied him for a long moment, probably trying to gauge whether Kane would be easily intimidated. Whatever he saw in Kane's eyes must have given him pause, because he stepped back slightly. "We'll be keeping an eye on things up here," Briggs said finally. "For the child's welfare, you understand." "I understand perfectly." After the men left, Kane waited a full hour before calling Sarah up from the cellar. She emerged, pale but dry-eyed, still clutching her doll. "They want to take me away," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, but I won't let them, because of what I told you." "About the judge and my papa?" Kane knelt before her, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah, your parents were murdered for their land. The same man who killed them put you up for adoption, hoping you'd disappear forever. But you didn't disappear, and that makes you dangerous to him." Sarah absorbed this with the eerie composure of a child who had already seen too much evil. "What do we do?" Kane felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. This brave little girl had survived horrors that would break grown men, and now she was looking to him for protection. He wouldn't fail her the way the system had. "We fight back," he said simply. "But first we need help, and we need to find proof of what really happened to your parents." That night, as Sarah slept by the fire with her doll clutched close, Kane sat planning. The locket was important, but it wasn't enough. He needed evidence, witnesses, something that would expose Crawford's crimes to the territorial authorities. He studied the photograph again by lamplight, memorizing every detail. Somewhere in that burned ranch house, there might still be evidence. Property deeds, survey records, something that Crawford had missed in his haste to cover his tracks. Kane had spent years avoiding entanglements, keeping his distance from other people's problems. But Sarah wasn't other people. She was his responsibility now, his daughter in every way that mattered. And Thomas Kane had never abandoned a mission or failed to protect those under his command. Judge Crawford had made a fatal error when he placed Sarah last in that auction, assuming she would be forgotten. Instead, he had put her directly into the hands of the one man in the territory with both the skills and the motivation to bring him down. The war for Sarah's future was just beginning, and Kane intended to win it. Kane kept his military service medals locked away in the bottom of his trunk for good reason. They represented a man he'd tried to leave behind. But as he held the tarnished bronze star in the lamplight, studying its familiar weight, he knew that man might be exactly what Sarah needed now. 3 days had passed since Deputy Briggs's visit, and Kane had spent them teaching Sarah skills no 7-year-old should need to learn. How to move silently through the forest, how to recognize the sound of approaching riders, how to hide so completely that even trained eyes would pass over her hiding spot. She absorbed the lessons with unsettling ease, as if survival had already become second nature. "Why did you stop being a soldier, Papa Tom?" Sarah asked as they practiced hand signals by the creek. She'd taken to calling him Papa Tom with increasing frequency, and each time it hit him like a warm punch to the chest. Kane paused in his demonstration of the danger signal. How did he explain 20 years of military service to a child? How did he describe leading men into battles where victory and defeat often looked identical from the ground level? Sometimes fighting ends, but the war doesn't, he said finally. I got tired of wars that never seemed to solve anything. Sarah nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Is that why you live up here by yourself? Used to live by myself, Kane corrected gently. Now I live with you. That evening, as Sarah practiced her letters by firelight, Kane had discovered she could already read simple words. He made a decision that had been building for days. The Bronze Star went into his coat pocket, along with his old service revolver, and the spare ammunition he'd hoped never to need again. I have to go to town tomorrow, he told Sarah. There's someone I need to talk to. Fear flickered across her face. Can I come with you? Not this time, sweetheart. It might not be safe. It's not safe for you either. Kane looked at her sharply. At 7 years old, Sarah understood tactical situations better than most adults. It was a skill born from trauma, but it might also keep her alive. You're right, he admitted. That's why we need to be smart about this. Dr. Martinez lived in a small house behind his medical practice, and he was one of the few men in Millbrook whom Kane trusted completely. They'd served together in the cavalry, though Martinez had chosen healing over fighting when their enlistments ended. Kane found him reading by lamplight. Medical journals spread across his kitchen table. Martinez looked up as Kane knocked, and his weathered face immediately creased with concern. Thomas, is the girl hurt? Not yet, Kane said grimly. But she might be if I don't get some answers. Over strong coffee, Kane told Martinez everything. The locket, Sarah's true identity, Crawford's involvement in the Hartwell murders. Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When Kane finished, the doctor sat back with a heavy sigh. I remember the Hartwell fire, Martinez said. Brought the bodies to me for examination. The burns were too extensive for proper identification, but Crawford insisted on a quick burial. Said it was more merciful for the community. Did you keep any records? Of course, including some details that didn't make it into the official report. Martinez moved to a locked cabinet and withdrew a leather journal. The man they said was James Hartwell had been shot before the fire started, close-range execution style. The woman had been beaten. Kane felt his hands clench into fists. You never reported this. To whom? Crawford was the only legal authority, and he made it clear that asking too many questions would be unhealthy for my practice. Martinez met Kane's eyes. I'm not proud of my silence, Thomas, but I had patients depending on me. I'm not judging you, Doc. I'm asking for your help now. Martinez nodded slowly. What do you need? Information. Crawford's been acquiring properties all over the territory. Tax sales, abandoned claims, suspicious deaths. Someone has to have noticed the pattern. Elena Vasquez might be able to help. She's the new school teacher, came here from Santa Fe about 6 months ago. She's been asking questions about local families, trying to understand the community history for her students. Kane made a mental note. A school teacher might be exactly what Sarah needed, both for education and as an ally. There's something else, Martinez continued. 3 days ago, Crawford had me examine 2 men who'd been injured in what he called a hunting accident, but their wounds were defensive cuts. The kind you get fighting someone with a knife. Anyone I'd know. The Kowalski brothers. They've been doing odd jobs for Crawford, if you know what I mean. Kane knew exactly what he meant. The Kowalski brothers were the kind of men who specialized in making problems disappear. Doc, if anything happens to me, I need you to take Sarah to the territorial marshal in Helena. Tell him everything I've told you tonight. Martinez gripped Kane's shoulder. Nothing's going to happen to you, Thomas. We won't let it. The ride back to the cabin took Kane through familiar mountain trails. But he found himself noting defensive positions, escape routes, places where a man and a child could make a stand if necessary. The bronze star in his pocket felt heavier with each mile. as if it carried the weight of all the battles he'd hoped to leave behind. Sarah was waiting by the window when he arrived, her small face pressed against the glass. She ran to him as he entered, and Kane swept her up in his arms, struck again by how fragile she felt. "Did you find out anything?" she asked. Kane sat her down and looked into those serious, dark eyes. "I found out that there are good people in town who want to help us. And I found out that your papa was a brave man who was trying to protect something important, the land, and you, and everything that was right and good." Kane brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Sarah, tomorrow I'm going to teach you some new things. Important things that I hope you'll never need to use, but that might keep you safe." She nodded solemnly. "Like what soldiers learn." "Some of it. But more like what a smart, brave girl learns when she needs to protect herself and the people she loves." The next morning, Kane began Sarah's education in earnest. He taught her to recognize the sound of different types of horses approaching, cavalry mounts versus working horses versus the kind of flashy animals that men like Crawford preferred. He showed her how to use the terrain around the cabin for concealment and how to signal him if she spotted danger while he was working. Most importantly, he taught her that being small wasn't always a disadvantage. "Big men expect big threats," he explained, as they practiced moving silently through the forest. "They look for other men with guns, not for little girls who know how to disappear." Sarah absorbed every lesson with frightening intensity. Sometimes Kane caught her staring into the distance with an expression far too mature for her years, and he wondered if he was protecting her childhood or destroying what little remained of it. But when she laughed at his clumsy attempts to braid her hair, or when she curled up against his side during their evening reading, he remembered that underneath the survival skills and trauma, she was still a 7-year-old girl who deserved love and safety. That night, as Kane cleaned his service revolver, a ritual he'd thought abandoned forever, Sarah sat nearby, carefully mending a torn seam in her doll's dress. "Papa Tom," she said quietly, "are we going to have to hurt people?" Kane's hands stilled on the gun. "I hope not, sweetheart. But sometimes good people have to be ready to fight bad people, or the bad people win. My real papa tried to fight. He still lost. Your real papa was one man caught by surprise. We're not caught by surprise, and we have friends now." Sarah considered this. "And you were a soldier." "Yes, a good soldier." Kane looked at the medal on the table beside him, remembering the men who had served under his command, the battles they'd won, the prices they'd all paid. "I was a soldier who brought his men home alive. That's all that mattered." Sarah nodded, as if this answered some important question in her mind. "Then you'll bring us home alive too." The simple faith in her voice nearly broke Kane's heart, but it also strengthened his resolve. Sarah had already lost one father to Crawford's greed and violence. She wouldn't lose another. Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of early snow and the distant howl of wolves. Inside the cabin, a veteran soldier cleaned his weapons while a 7-year-old girl mended her only toy, both of them preparing for a war that neither had chosen, but both were determined to survive. The bronze star caught the firelight, its tarnished surface reflecting the faces of the unlikely family that had formed around a shared need for justice and belonging. Some medals were earned in battle, Kane reflected. Others were earned in the quiet moments when you decided that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The primer book had seen better days, its pages yellowed with age and corners worn soft from countless small hands. But when Elena Vasquez placed it gently on her desk and smiled at Sarah, the book seemed to glow with possibility. "Reading opens doors to everywhere," Elena said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her New Mexico heritage. "Shall we see what adventures wait inside?" Sarah clutched Kane's hand as they stood in the doorway of the one-room schoolhouse. 3 weeks had passed since his conversation with Dr. Martinez, and Kane had finally decided that Sarah needed more than survival skills. She needed education, normalcy, and the chance to be around other children, even if those other children weren't entirely welcoming. "You sure about this, Papa Tom?" Sarah whispered. eyeing the cluster of children who had stopped their morning games to stare at the newcomers. Kane squeezed her hand. "Miss Vasquez is a good person. She'll take care of you while you're here." Elena approached them with the easy confidence of a woman accustomed to winning over nervous children and skeptical parents. She was younger than Kane had expected, perhaps 30, with intelligent dark eyes and prematurely grey streaks in her black hair that suggested she'd seen more of life than her years implied. "You must be Sarah," Elena said, crouching to the girl's eye level. "Dr. Martinez told me you're already reading some words. That's wonderful." Sarah nodded shyly, still pressed against Kane's side. "And you're Mr. Kane," Elena continued, rising to offer him her hand. Her grip was firm, direct. "I understand Sarah has had some difficult experiences. I want you to know that this classroom is a safe place for all children, regardless of their circumstances." Kane heard the subtle emphasis and understood that Elena knew more about Sarah's situation than she was saying in front of the other children. Dr. Martinez had chosen his ally. "Well, I'll be back at 3 o'clock. Kane told Sarah, kissing the top of her head. "Remember what we practiced," Sarah nodded gravely. They'd rehearsed this morning, how to sit near the door, how to watch for strangers approaching the school, how to find him if trouble came. It broke Kane's heart that a 7-year-old needed such knowledge, but recent events had taught him that innocence was a luxury they couldn't afford. The morning went better than Kane had dared hope. When he returned at the appointed time, he found Sarah bent over a slate, carefully forming letters, while Elena provided gentle guidance. But he also noticed the empty desks around her, the way the other children clustered at the far end of the room, whispering behind their hands. "How was school?" Kane asked as they walked home. "Miss Vasquez is nice," Sarah said diplomatically. "She says I'm reading at a 4th grade level already." "That's wonderful. What about the other children?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "They think I'm different. Some of their parents told them not to play with me." Kane felt familiar anger building in his chest. "What did you do?" "I ignored them. Like you taught me." Sarah looked up at him with those two serious eyes. "But there's one boy, Jimmy Peterson. He was nice to me. His mama died last year, so he knows what it's like to be sad." Kane made a mental note to thank Jimmy Peterson's father when he had the chance. That evening, as Sarah practiced her letters by the fireplace, Kane found himself watching her with new eyes. The child who had cowered in the corner just weeks ago was slowly emerging from her shell, revealing a sharp intelligence and quiet determination that reminded him painfully of her mother in the locket photograph. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Each morning, Kane would ride Sarah to school, spending the time teaching her to handle a horse properly. "A good horseman is never truly trapped," he told her, remembering his cavalry training. "Always know where your mount is and how to reach him quickly." Each afternoon, he would collect her and listen to her careful reports about school, which children were kind, which adults had asked questions about her living situation, whether anyone had shown unusual interest in her background. Sarah had become his best intelligence asset. Though he hated that she needed to be, Elena Vasquez proved to be more than just a school teacher. During parent conferences, she casually mentioned to Kane that several families had suffered mysterious property losses in recent years, always followed by generous offers from unnamed buyers who turned out to be connected to Judge Crawford. "The Kowalski farm," she said, consulting her notes, "lost for unpaid taxes, even though neighbors swear the family was current on all payments. The Morrison Ranch, sold after the father died in a hunting accident that no one witnessed. The Garrett homestead, abandoned after their well was poisoned and their livestock died." Kane studied her carefully. "You've been documenting this. I believe in understanding the community where I teach. Children's stories often reveal more truth than official records." Elena's eyes met his. "Sarah isn't the only child in my classroom who's lost family under suspicious circumstances." That night, Kane sat down with pen and paper, creating his own documentation. Names, dates, properties, circumstances. A pattern emerged that would have been clear to any military intelligence officer, a systematic campaign to acquire territory through intimidation, fraud, and murder. Judge Crawford wasn't just corrupt. He was running a sophisticated criminal operation. The realization crystallized Kane's thinking. This wasn't about one little girl's inheritance anymore. It was about stopping a predator who had already destroyed multiple families and would continue doing so until someone with the skills and determination to oppose him took action. Kane looked over at Sarah, who was absorbed in her primer book, lips moving silently as she sounded out difficult words. The sight filled him with fierce protectiveness and something else, pride. Despite everything she'd endured, she was thriving, learning, growing stronger every day. 2 months into the school year, Sarah came home with news that changed everything. "Miss Vasquez wants to see you," she announced as Kane helped her down from her horse. "She says it's important." Kane found Elena waiting in the schoolhouse after the other children had left. Her expression was serious, and she gestured for him to sit in one of the adult-sized chairs she kept for parent conferences. "I've been watching Sarah very carefully," she began. "Not just as her teacher, but as someone who understands what children reveal when they think no one is listening." Kane tensed. "Is there a problem?" "On the contrary. Sarah is remarkable. Her reading comprehension is beyond anything I've seen in a child her age. She grasps mathematical concepts that most children don't encounter until much later. And her memory is extraordinary. She can recall conversations, details, sequences of events with perfect accuracy." Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Kane, I believe Sarah may have witnessed more than she's told you about her parents' death. And I think she's been protecting herself by not remembering certain details." "What kind of details?" "Yesterday she drew a picture during art time. She said it was her old house, but she included elements that weren't visible from the outside: the placement of furniture, the location of a safe behind a bookshelf, even the pattern of stones in the cellar wall." Elena handed him the drawing. "She drew this from memory with precision that suggests she spent considerable time in that cellar." Kane studied the childish sketch, noting the careful attention to structural details. If Sarah had been hidden in the cellar during her parents' murder, she might have heard conversations, names, specific information that could be crucial to exposing Crawford's crimes, but accessing those memories could also re-traumatize her in ways that might never heal. "What are you suggesting?" Kane asked. "I'm suggesting that Sarah might be the key to bringing justice for all the families Crawford has destroyed. But I'm also saying that as her teacher and as someone who cares about her welfare, I believe she should have the choice whether to remember." That evening, Kane sat Sarah down by the fire and had the most difficult conversation of his life. He explained in terms a 7-year-old could understand that her memories of that terrible night might help protect other families from similar tragedies. Sarah listened with the same grave attention she brought to everything important. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "If I remember," she said finally, "will the bad men come after us?" Kane chose honesty. "They might, but we'll be ready for them. And if I don't remember, other children might lose their mamas and papas like I did." "It's possible." Sarah hugged her doll tight, and Kane could see her wrestling with a burden no child should carry. Finally, she looked up at him with eyes that held more courage than most adults could claim. "I want to remember," she said simply. "My mama and papa would want me to be brave." Kane pulled her into his arms, amazed once again by the strength contained in such a small frame. Tomorrow, they would begin the delicate process of helping Sarah recover memories she had buried for her own protection. Tonight, he would hold her close and promise himself that whatever those memories revealed, he would make sure the men responsible paid for every moment of pain they had caused. The primer book lay open on the table beside them, its pages filled with simple words and moral lessons. But the real education happening in their mountain cabin was far more complex. Lessons about justice and courage, about the price of standing up to evil, and about the kind of love that chooses to fight for what matters most, no matter the cost. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the mountains in deceptive peace. Inside, a former soldier and a brave little girl, prepared to unlock secrets that would either bring justice to their community or destroy them both in the attempt. Kane's hunting knife had ended more lives than he cared to remember. But as he ran the whetstone along its edge in the lamplight, he found himself hoping it would serve only as a tool and symbol now. The blade caught the fire's reflection, and for a moment he saw his own face distorted in the steel, older, harder, marked by years of violence he'd thought left behind. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, eyes closed, her small hands resting on her knees in the meditation position Elena had taught her. They'd been working for 2 weeks now, gently coaxing memories from the hidden places where a traumatized child had locked them away. "I can see the cellar stairs," Sarah said quietly, her voice distant. "Mama pushed me down there so fast I skinned my knee. She said to be quiet as a mouse, no matter what I heard." Kane set down his knife, giving Sarah his full attention. These sessions were delicate work. Push too hard, and the memories would retreat deeper, but without enough encouragement. The crucial details might remain buried forever. "What else do you remember about the cellar, sweetheart?" "It smelled like potatoes and dirt. And there was a crack in the wall where I could see a little bit of light from upstairs." Sarah's face scrunched in concentration. "I could hear voices. Papa was talking to someone, but his voice sounded scared. Could you hear what they were saying?" Sarah nodded slowly. "The man said Papa had been given lots of chances to be smart about things. Papa said the land belonged to our family, and he wasn't selling. Then the man said—" She stopped, her breath quickening. Kane moved closer but didn't touch her. Physical contact could sometimes jar someone out of a memory state. "It's all right, Sarah. You're safe here with me. The man said Papa was making things hard on everyone, especially me. He said accidents happen to little girls when their papas don't listen to reason." Kane felt his hands clench into fists. Even filtered through a 7-year-old's memory, the threat was clear. Crawford or his men had used Sarah as leverage against her father, and when that failed, they'd carried out their promise. "Did you recognize the voice, Sarah?" "It was the judge. I heard him talking at church sometimes. He has a voice like when you pour molasses, all thick and sweet but wrong somehow." The confirmation sent cold fury through Kane's veins, but he kept his voice gentle. What happened next? Sarah's eyes flew open, the spell broken. "I don't want to remember any more tonight, Papa Tom. Can we just sit by the fire?" Kane gathered her into his arms, feeling her small body trembling. "Of course we can. You did very well, sweetheart. You're helping more people than you know." As Sarah dozed against his shoulder, Kane's mind worked through the implications of what they'd learned. Sarah had been deliberately threatened, which made her parents' murder premeditated rather than a crime of opportunity. That moved it from territorial jurisdiction into federal territory. Threatening a child to coerce property sales constituted organized criminal activity under federal law, but they still needed more evidence. Crawford was too smart and too connected to be brought down by the testimony of a traumatized child alone. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Kane was teaching Sarah to identify edible plants when they heard horses approaching through the trees. But these weren't the threatening sounds of Crawford's men. These were the steady, purposeful hoofbeats of working animals ridden by people who belonged in mountain country. 3 riders emerged from the forest. Dr. Martinez on his familiar bay gelding, Elena on a compact mare that moved like she'd been bred for rough terrain, and a man Kane didn't recognize, middle-aged, wearing the practical clothes of a rancher, with eyes that held the same haunted look Kane saw in his own mirror. "Thomas," Dr. Martinez called as they approached. "We need to talk." The stranger dismounted with the careful movements of a man carrying old wounds. When he turned toward Kane, his face was weathered by sun and grief in equal measure. "Frank Morrison," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I believe you knew my boy Billy before he died." Kane remembered Billy Morrison, a good soldier, steady under fire. who'd written letters home to his father about wanting to return to ranch work when the war ended. Billy had died at Antietam, cut down by grape shot while trying to reach wounded comrades. Billy was a fine man, Kane said simply. I was sorry to hear about your ranch, Frank's jaw tightened. That's why I'm here. Elena tells me your little girl might know something about what really happened to the Hartwell family. Well, I know something too, something that might help. They gathered around Kane's kitchen table while Sarah played quietly in the corner, apparently absorbed in her doll, but actually listening to every word, a skill Kane had reluctantly taught her for her own protection. After Billy died, I threw myself into ranch work, Frank began. Figured hard labor might numb the pain, but keeping a spread running alone is near impossible, especially when you start having problems. What kind of problems? Elena asked. The kind that happen right before Judge Crawford offers to help you out of your difficulties. Frank's voice carried bitter experience. First, my prize bull died. Vet said it looked like poison, but he couldn't prove it. Then my main water source got contaminated. Whole herd got sick. Lost half my cattle before I figured out someone had dumped something upstream. Kane leaned forward. You have proof of this? Better than proof. I have a witness. Frank glanced toward Sarah, lowering his voice. My neighbor's boy, Tommy Kowalski, saw men dumping barrels into Willow Creek in the middle of the night. Recognized his own uncles doing it. Kane felt the pieces clicking together. The Kowalski brothers work for Crawford. They do now. But Tommy's just 14, and he's scared to death of what his uncles might do if they find out he saw them. Elena spoke up. Frank lost his ranch 6 months ago. Crawford bought it at a tax sale for a fraction of its value. But here's the interesting part, Frank continued. 2 weeks after the sale went through, I got a visit from a man representing some mining company back east. Turns out my land sits on a major copper vein. They offered me 50 times what Crawford paid for it. Kane whistled low. Crawford's not just stealing land for grazing or farming. He's surveying for mineral rights. Has to be, Dr. Martinez agreed. That would explain why he's so particular about which properties he targets. He's probably got geological surveys done ahead of time. Sarah looked up from her doll. Like Papa's land. The adults fell silent, remembering that young ears were listening. Maybe like your Papa's land, Kane said gently. Is that all right to talk about? Sarah nodded seriously. Papa found rocks once that were real pretty, green and blue colors. He said maybe someday they'd be worth something, but not to tell anyone, because it might make bad people want to take our land. Kane and Frank exchanged glances. Copper ore often showed green and blue coloration, especially if it contained malachite or azurite. James Hartwell might have discovered what he was sitting on, which would explain Crawford's particular interest in eliminating the family. Frank, Kane said, would young Tommy be willing to talk to a federal marshal if we could guarantee his safety? Maybe. His parents are good people, just scared of the Kowalski brothers. If they thought it would help stop this from happening to other families. Elena had been quiet through most of the conversation, but now she spoke with quiet determination. There's something else you should know. I've been corresponding with teachers in other towns throughout the territory. The pattern extends far beyond Millbrook. She produced a leather portfolio filled with carefully organized notes and letters. Bozeman, Helena Beauty. Wherever there's been a discovery of mineral wealth, there've been mysterious property transfers, unexplained deaths, and families forced off their land through legal manipulation. Elena's teacher's training showed in her methodical documentation. I believe Judge Crawford is part of a larger organization that's systematically stealing mineral rights across Montana territory. Kane studied the documentation, his military mind automatically analyzing the scope and organization required for such an operation. This wasn't the work of one corrupt judge. It was a carefully coordinated conspiracy that likely reached all the way to the territorial capital. If you're right, he said slowly, then Sarah isn't just a witness to a single crime. She's evidence of a pattern that could bring down an entire criminal network, which makes her incredibly valuable, Dr. Martinez added grimly, and incredibly dangerous to keep alive. That night, after their visitors had departed, Kane sat watching Sarah practice her letters by firelight. The hunting knife lay on the table beside him, its edge sharp enough to shave with. For the first time since bringing Sarah home, he found himself hoping he wouldn't have to use it, but hope and preparation were different things entirely. "Papa Tom," Sarah said without looking up from her slate, "are we going to be in danger soon?" Kane considered lying, softening the truth to preserve what remained of her childhood innocence. But Sarah had earned honesty through her courage, and lies would serve neither of them well in the battles ahead. "Yes, sweetheart. I think we are." Sarah nodded as if she'd expected this answer. "Then we better get ready." She returned to her letters with renewed concentration. And Kane realized she was practicing more than just spelling. She was preparing for a future where literacy might mean the difference between justice and injustice, between survival and defeat. Outside, winter wind howled through the mountain peaks, carrying the promise of storms to come. Inside their cabin, a former soldier and a brave little girl continued their quiet preparation for a war that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of everyone who had ever stood against corruption and lost. The hunting knife waited on the table, ready to serve whatever purpose the coming days might demand. Elena's cross necklace caught the firelight as she bent over Sarah's arithmetic slate, her patient voice guiding the girl through multiplication tables. The silver pendant had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had survived Apache raids, Mexican revolutions, and the slow starvation of 3 consecutive failed harvests. It had been blessed by priests in Santa Fe, and had never left Elena's throat since her 15th birthday. Now, watching Sarah work through problems with the same determined focus she brought to everything important, Elena found herself praying to that cross for wisdom and protection for the unlikely family that had formed around their kitchen table. 2 weeks had passed since Frank Morrison's visit, and their small group had grown into something approaching a proper resistance. Frank had convinced young Tommy Kowalski to speak with Kane carefully, privately, and with assurances that the boy's safety came before any legal considerations. The story Tommy told painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached deeper than any of them had imagined. "My uncle's been doing jobs for the judge since before I can remember," Tommy had whispered, his 14-year-old voice shaking with the weight of family betrayal. "They don't think I know what they do, but I hear things. I see things." Kane had listened with the patience of a man who understood that frightened witnesses needed time and gentle encouragement. Tommy revealed that the Kowalski brothers had been Crawford's primary enforcement team for years, poisoning water supplies, killing livestock, intimidating families, and when necessary, eliminating those who refused to cooperate. But the most damning revelation came when Tommy described overhearing his uncles discussing their biggest job, the elimination of the Hartwell family. They laughed about it, Tommy had said, tears streaming down his young face. Said the woman fought like a wildcat, but the man went down easy. Said they made sure it looked like raiders done it, but they was real careful to make sure the little girl didn't survive neither. Kane had felt his blood turn to ice. Sarah was supposed to have died in that cellar. The fact that she'd survived and made it to the orphanage was either remarkable luck or divine intervention. But either way, it meant Crawford's entire plan had been built on the assumption that there were no witnesses to his crimes. Now, as Elena helped Sarah with her studies while Kane cleaned weapons by the fire, the full implications of their situation had become clear. Sarah wasn't just a witness. She was living proof that Crawford's operations could be exposed and destroyed, which meant that every day she remained alive was another day the judge's criminal empire remained vulnerable. "Miss Eleanor," Sarah said, looking up from her slate, "why do some people do bad things to other people?" Elena glanced at Kane, who nodded slightly. They'd agreed that Sarah deserved honest answers about the world she was navigating. Even if those answers were difficult to hear, sometimes people get so hungry for money or power that they forget about right and wrong, Elena said carefully. They start thinking that what they want is more important than other people's lives and happiness. Sarah considered this with the serious expression that had become her trademark. "Is that why the judge wanted our land? Because he forgot about right and wrong?" "I think the judge never learned about right and wrong to begin with," Kane said from his position by the fire. "Some people are born with something missing inside them, the part that feels sorry when they hurt others. Like a sickness." "Like a sickness," Elena agreed, "but one that can't be cured with medicine." That night, after Sarah had fallen asleep by the fire, Elena and Kane sat together in the comfortable quiet they'd learned to share. Their relationship had deepened naturally over the weeks of shared danger and mutual concern for Sarah's welfare. Elena's faith provided an anchor for Kane's military pragmatism, while his protective instincts gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Thomas," Elena said quietly, her fingers tracing the cross at her throat, "I need to tell you something. I've been corresponding with my cousin in Santa Fe. He's a federal marshal. He's agreed to come here and investigate, but it could be several weeks before he arrives." Kane looked at her sharply. "You contacted federal authorities without telling me?" "I was protecting you. If Crawford has spies monitoring telegraph communications, it was safer for the message to come from someone he doesn't see as a threat." Kane felt a surge of admiration for Elena's strategic thinking. She was right. A school teacher's correspondence with family would attract far less attention than communications from a known adversary like himself. "What did you tell him?" "Everything. The pattern of property seizures, the suspicious deaths, the mineral rights connection. I also sent copies of all the documentation we've gathered." Elena met his eyes. "Thomas, I think we need to consider that Sarah might not be safe here much longer." Before Kane could respond, a sound outside made them both freeze, the soft nicker of a horse, muffled as if someone was trying to keep the animal quiet. Kane was on his feet instantly, service revolver in hand. He moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. In the pale moonlight, he could make out shapes moving through the trees, at least 4 men, approaching the cabin with the careful stealth of those who meant harm. "Elena," he whispered urgently, "awake Sarah and get her to the root cellar, now." Elena moved with quiet efficiency, gently rousing Sarah and guiding her toward the kitchen trapdoor. Sarah came awake instantly, her survival instincts sharp as ever. "Bad men," she whispered. "Yes, sweetheart. Into the cellar, just like we practiced." As Elena and Sarah disappeared below, Kane took up position by the front window. His cabin had been built with defense in mind. Thick log walls, reinforced door, limited approaches. If Crawford's men wanted a fight, they'd get one. But they didn't come with guns drawn and threats shouted. Instead, a voice called out from the darkness, cultured, familiar, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Kane, Judge Crawford here. I'd like to have a word with you." Kane considered his options. Crawford had brought men with him, which suggested he wasn't entirely confident in his legal authority. But he was also announcing himself rather than attacking, which meant he still hoped to resolve this situation without violence. "Come ahead, Judge," Kane called back. "But leave your men where they are." Crawford emerged from the tree line alone, hands visible and empty. In the moonlight, he looked every inch the respectable frontier judge, well-dressed, dignified, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had never been successfully opposed. Kane opened the door, but remained in the doorway, his gun visible but not directly threatening. "Hell of a thing. Living way up here," Crawford said conversationally. "Must get lonely in the winter months. I like the quiet." "What do you want, Judge?" "To offer you an opportunity to be reasonable about a difficult situation." Crawford stepped closer, his voice taking on the honey-smooth tone Sarah had described. "That little girl you've taken in, there are some questions about her legal status that need to be resolved. The adoption papers are in order." "Oh, I'm sure they are. But you see, we've recently discovered some irregularities in the original placement process. Turns out the child may have family back east, distant relatives who've been searching for her since the tragic incident that made her an orphan." Kane felt his jaw tighten. Convenient timing for this discovery. These things take time to sort through. Bureaucracy, you understand. Crawford's smile didn't reach his eyes. The point is, the child needs to be returned to town while we sort out the legal complexities. I'm sure you can appreciate that it's in everyone's best interest, especially hers, to handle this properly. And if I refuse? Crawford's expression hardened slightly. Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, there are also some questions about your own fitness as a guardian. A man with your background, living alone with a young girl in such an isolated location. People talk, Mr. Kane. Sometimes they say things that can be very damaging to a man's reputation. The threat was clear and particularly vicious. Crawford was suggesting he would spread rumors of impropriety between Kane and Sarah, rumors that could destroy Kane's reputation and justify removing Sarah by force. Kane felt the familiar cold calm settle over him, the same emotional detachment that had kept him alive through countless battles. Crawford had just made a fatal error in judgment. He'd threatened not just Kane's life, but his honor. There were some lines that couldn't be crossed, Judge, Kane said quietly. I think you should leave now. I'm offering you a chance to be reasonable. I'm giving you a chance to walk away alive. Something in Kane's voice must have penetrated Crawford's arrogance, because the judge took an involuntary step backward. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and Crawford saw what Sarah had seen that day at the auction, a man capable of violence in defense of what he loved. You're making a mistake, Kane. A very serious mistake, probably. But it's my mistake to make. Crawford stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward the tree line. Kane watched until the judge and his men had disappeared into the forest, then waited another hour to make sure they were truly gone, before calling Elena and Sarah up from the cellar. What did he want? Elena asked. Kane told them, watching Sarah's face closely as he described Crawford's demands and threats. Her expression grew more serious with each word, but she didn't seem surprised or afraid. He's scared, Sarah said finally. He wouldn't come here himself if he wasn't scared of what I might know. Kane realized she was right. Crawford's visit had been a desperate gambit, an attempt to regain control of a situation that was slipping away from him, which meant their small resistance was having more impact than they'd realized. What do we do now? Elena asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her cross. Kane looked at the two people who had become his family, the woman whose faith anchored his fury, and the child whose courage humbled him daily. Now we finish what we started, he said simply. Crawford has shown his hand, and he's not as strong as he pretends to be. It's time to take the fight to him. Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of a hard winter ahead. Inside the cabin, three people bound by love and shared purpose began planning for a confrontation that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of justice in their small corner of the world. Elena's cross caught the firelight as she leaned forward, her voice steady with conviction. Then God help us all, she said quietly, because we're going to need all the divine assistance we can get. The forged documents lay scattered across Kane's kitchen table like evidence of a crime more terrible than any he'd imagined. Crawford's papers, the ones Sarah had somehow managed to steal during the judge's midnight visit to their cabin, revealed a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple land grabbing. They also revealed a family betrayal so profound that Kane felt physically sick reading them. Details I don't understand, Sarah said quietly, standing beside Kane's chair as he studied the documents by lamplight. This paper says Mama's name was Crawford, but her name was Hartwell. Eleanor sat across from them, her teacher's training evident in how she'd organized the papers into logical categories. Legal documents, correspondence, financial records, all bearing the official seal of Judge Harlan Crawford's court. Sarah, Eleanor said gently, sometimes people change their names when they get married. Your mama's name was Crawford before she married your papa. Kane found the birth certificate that confirmed it. Margaret Louise Crawford, born 1842. Father listed as Harlan J. Crawford. Mother deceased. Sarah's grandmother had died in childbirth, leaving Margaret to be raised by a man whose capacity for love had apparently died with his wife. So the judge is... Sarah's voice trailed off as the implications hit her. Your grandfather, Kane finished grimly. Which means he killed his own daughter and son-in-law for their land. The horror of it settled over the cabin like a suffocating blanket. Kane had seen evil in many forms during his military service, but the calculated murder of one's own child for financial gain struck him as a new level of depravity. But the documents revealed even more disturbing truths. Margaret Crawford had apparently tried to expose her father's criminal activities years before her death. A series of letters to territorial authorities detailed suspicious property transfers, intimidation tactics, and several unexplained deaths that followed the same pattern as the Hartwell murders. The responses to her letters were filed with the outgoing correspondence, polite dismissals that cited lack of evidence and suggested that young Mrs. Hartwell was perhaps allowing emotion to color her judgment of respected community leader Judge Crawford. No one had listened. No one had investigated. Margaret Crawford Hartwell had died trying to stop her father's crimes, and the system had failed her completely. There's more, Elena said quietly, lifting a bundle of financial documents. Thomas, look at these bank transfers. Kane studied the papers, his military experience with logistics helping him trace the flow of money. Crawford wasn't working alone. He was part of an organized network that included territorial officials, mining company representatives, and federal appointees. The scope was staggering. Dozens of properties across Montana Territory had been systematically acquired through fraud, intimidation, and murder. The mineral wealth extracted from those lands was being funneled to investors in Chicago, Denver, and San Francisco through a complex web of shell companies and fictitious partnerships. Crawford was just one regional coordinator in what appeared to be a territorial-wide conspiracy to steal mineral rights from legitimate property owners. Sarah, Kane said slowly, how did you get these papers? Sarah looked uncomfortable, as if she knew she'd done something wrong, but wasn't entirely sorry for it. When the bad man came to talk to you, I snuck outside through the back window. I saw him put some papers on his saddle while he talked to you. I thought they might be important. Kane stared at her. You went outside? While those men were here? I stayed in the shadows like you taught me, and I was real quiet. Kane felt a mixture of pride and terror. Sarah had shown remarkable initiative and courage, but she'd also taken an incredible risk. If Crawford's men had spotted her, don't ever do anything like that again without telling me first, Kane said firmly. I know you were trying to help, but it's too dangerous. Sarah nodded solemnly. I'm sorry, Papa Tom, but I'm glad I got the papers. Now we know the truth. Elena had been examining another set of documents during their conversation. Now she looked up with an expression of shocked realization. Thomas, there's something else. These property deeds, they're not just forged. They're forgeries of forgeries. She spread several papers before them. Look at this. Crawford's been selling the same mineral rights to multiple buyers. He's been paid for your parents' land at least 4 times over, Sarah. Kane understood immediately. It's fraud on top of murder. When the mining companies try to develop their claims, they'll discover conflicting ownership. Crawford will be long gone by then, but the companies will be left holding worthless paper. Which means this conspiracy has a time limit, Elena continued. Eventually the fraud will be discovered. Crawford and his partners need to liquidate their operations and disappear before the victims realize they've been cheated. Kane felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. Crawford's recent desperation, his willingness to visit Kane personally, his threats about Sarah, it all made sense now. The judge wasn't just trying to cover up past crimes. He was racing against time to complete his operations before the entire scheme collapsed. How long do you think we have? Elena asked. Kane studied the financial documents, looking for patterns and timelines. Based on these dates, I'd guess they're planning to wrap up operations within the next few months. Which means they'll be eliminating loose ends soon. Like us, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Like us, Kane agreed. That night, after Sarah had fallen asleep by the fire, Kane and Eleanor sat together, planning their next moves. The forged documents were damning evidence, but they needed to get them to federal authorities before Crawford realized they were missing. My cousin won't arrive for at least another week, Eleanor said. Can we hold out that long? Kane checked his weapons again. The service revolver, the hunting knife, and a Winchester rifle he'd hoped never to use in anger again. We can try. But Crawford knows those documents are missing by now. He'll be coming for us soon, and he'll be coming with everything he has. Then we need allies. People who can help us defend ourselves and protect Sarah. Kane thought of Frank Morrison, Dr. Martinez, even young Tommy Kowalski. Good people who had already risked much to oppose Crawford's corruption. But asking them to take up arms against a territorial judge and his hired killers was asking them to risk everything. On the other hand, if Crawford succeeded in eliminating Kane, Elena, and Sarah, there would be no one left to stop his criminal enterprise. Other families would die, other children would be orphaned, and the conspiracy would spread until it consumed the entire territory. Elena, Kane said quietly, there's something I need to tell you about what might happen in the coming days. She looked at him with eyes that held both love and understanding. You're planning something dangerous. I'm planning to end this, one way or another. Kane took her hand, feeling the calluses from teaching and the strength from faith. Crawford made one mistake when he killed his own daughter. He proved that there's no limit to what he'll do for money and power, but that also means there's no reasoning with him, no negotiating a peaceful solution. Kane nodded grimly. This ends with either Crawford dead or in federal custody. There's no middle ground anymore. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers unconsciously finding her cross. When she spoke, her voice was steady with resolve. Then we'd better make sure he doesn't take Sarah with him when he falls. Outside, the mountain wind howled through the peaks, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of a winter that might be the last they would see together. Inside the cabin, two adults bound by love and shared purpose continued planning for a war that would determine whether justice could still triumph over corruption in their small corner of the world. The forged documents lay on the table between them. Silent testimony to crimes that demanded justice and a conspiracy that threatened the foundations of legitimate government. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and quite possibly the final confrontation between a man who had chosen love over safety and a system that had chosen profit over human lives. Kane studied Sarah's sleeping face in the firelight, noting the peaceful expression that had become more common in recent weeks. Despite everything, the trauma, the danger, the terrible revelations about her family, she was growing stronger, more confident, more sure of her place in their unlikely family. Crawford had intended for Sarah to disappear, to become just another forgotten victim of his greed. Instead, she had become the key to his destruction. There was a kind of poetic justice in that, Kane thought. The child he had tried to erase would be the one to expose his crimes to the world, if they lived long enough to see justice done. Kane's strategic map covered every inch of his kitchen table, hand-drawn lines marking elevation changes, tree cover, creek beds, and approach routes around his mountain cabin. 20 years of military service had taught him that battles were won through preparation, and the coming fight would require every tactical advantage he could create. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, cleaning Kane's service revolver with the methodical precision he'd taught her. At 7 years old, she could field strip, clean, and reassemble the weapon faster than most cavalry recruits. The sight should have horrified him, but Kane had learned to accept that Sarah's survival might depend on skills no child should need. "Papa Tom," Sarah said without looking up from her work. How many men do you think he'll bring?" Kane studied his map, considering what he knew about Crawford's resources. "Probably 6 to 8. Enough to surround the cabin, but not so many that they get in each other's way. The Kowalski brothers." "Definitely! They're his primary enforcers." Kane marked 2 X's on the map. "Deputy Briggs, probably 2 or 3 more hired guns from out of town." Elena looked up from the medical supplies she was organizing. 3 days had passed since they'd discovered Crawford's forged documents, and she'd been preparing for the possibility of treating gunshot wounds with the same calm efficiency she brought to lesson planning. My cousin's telegram said he'll arrive tomorrow afternoon, she said. If we can hold out until then, we can't count on cavalry arriving in time, Kane interrupted gently. We have to assume we're on our own. He turned back to the map, pointing to various defensive positions. Sarah, remember what we practiced about the root cellar. If shooting starts, you get down there and stay down no matter what you hear. Understand? Sarah nodded, but her expression suggested she had other ideas. Kane recognized the look. It was the same stubborn determination her mother had shown in the Lockett photograph. I want to help fight, Sarah said quietly. Your job is to stay alive. That's the most important thing you can do. But if you and Miss Elena get hurt, then you take the documents to Dr. Martinez and tell him everything you know. Promise me, Sarah, she promised, but Kane could see the reluctance in her young face. Sarah had the heart of a fighter, which was both a blessing and a worry. Her courage might save them all, or it might get her killed. Frank Morrison arrived just after noon, leading a small group of townspeople who had finally decided they'd had enough of Judge Crawford's reign of terror. Tommy Kowalski rode behind him looking scared but determined. Dr. Martinez brought up the rear, his medical bag secured to his saddle and a hunting rifle across his back. How many men can we count on? Kane asked as they gathered around his kitchen table. Frank did a quick count. 8 of us, plus you and Elena. Not all of us are fighters, but we're all tired of watching good families get destroyed. Tommy's been our scout, Dr. Martinez added. Tell him what you saw, son. Tommy Kowalski cleared his throat nervously. My uncle's been gathering men at the old Murphy place, about 5 miles south. I counted at least 10 riders yesterday, maybe more. They got extra horses, enough ammunition for a small war, and they've been drinking heavy. Kane felt his jaw tighten. Drunk gunmen were unpredictable, dangerous in ways that sober professionals weren't. When do you think they'll move? Elena asked. Tonight, Kane said with grim certainty. Crawford knows we have his documents. He can't afford to wait much longer. Frank studied Kane's defensive map with the eyes of a man who'd learned tactics the hard way during range wars. Your cabin's well positioned, but 10 men can surround it pretty easily. We need to think about fallback positions. Kane pointed to a ridgeline about half a mile north of the cabin. There's an old mining camp up there, good cover, multiple escape routes, and we'd have the high ground. Problem is, we'd have to abandon the cabin and everything in it, including most of our supplies and ammunition. Dr. Martinez observed, but we'd have a better chance of holding out until help arrives. Elena countered. Kane looked around the table at the faces of people who had become his unlikely army, a displaced rancher, a frightened boy, a country doctor, a school teacher with more courage than sense, and a handful of townspeople who had decided that someone needed to take a stand. None of them were soldiers. Most had never been in a gunfight, but they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their community's future. That gave them an advantage that hired killers couldn't match. We'll prepare both positions, Kane decided. Cabin first, mining camp as fallback. If we can convince Crawford we're holed up in the cabin, maybe we can draw his men into a trap. They spent the afternoon preparing. Kane positioned his volunteers at strategic points around the cabin, each with clear fields of fire and predetermined fallback routes. Dr. Martinez established a medical station in the most protected corner of the cabin. Elena and Sarah organized ammunition and supplies for rapid movement if retreat became necessary. As evening approached, Kane found himself checking and rechecking weapons, ammunition counts and defensive positions. The familiar pre-battle routine brought back memories he'd tried to forget, the weight of responsibility for other men's lives. The knowledge that his decisions would determine who lived and who died. Sarah appeared at his elbow as he adjusted the sights on his Winchester rifle. Are you scared, Papa Tom? Kane considered lying, then decided Sarah deserved the truth. Yes, sweetheart. I'm scared, me too. But I'm not scared of dying. I'm scared of them hurting you and Miss Elena. Kane knelt to her eye level, struck again by the courage contained in such a small frame. Sarah, no matter what happens tonight, I want you to know something. Choosing you was the best decision I ever made. You've made me remember what it feels like to have a family worth fighting for. Sarah threw her arms around his neck, hugging him with desperate intensity. "I love you, Papa Tom. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." Eleanor joined them, her cross necklace catching the last rays of sunset through the cabin window. The men are in position. Frank's watching the south approach. Dr. Martinez has the east side covered. Tommy's hidden where he can see the main trail. Kane stood, feeling the weight of command settling over him like a familiar coat. Then we wait. As darkness fell over the mountain, Kane made final checks of their defenses. The cabin windows had been reinforced with furniture and spare lumber. Ammunition was distributed to each position. Escape routes were clearly marked and rehearsed. Sarah sat by the fire, ostensibly reading her primer book, but actually listening to every sound from outside. Her doll lay in her lap, the hidden compartment where her mother's locket had been stored now empty, but somehow still significant. "Elena," Kane said quietly. "If this goes badly, it won't," she interrupted firmly. "We have too much to live for." Kane hoped she was right. But as he heard the distant sound of horses moving through the forest, too many horses, moving too carefully to be anything but trouble, he found himself offering a prayer to whatever powers protected the innocent and punished the wicked. Outside, Judge Crawford's final assault was beginning. Inside the cabin, a former soldier, a faithful teacher, a brave little girl, and a handful of determined townspeople prepared to make their stand against corruption, greed, and the kind of evil that destroyed families for profit. The strategic map lay forgotten on the kitchen table, its careful markings and tactical considerations about to be tested in the crucible of actual combat. Win or lose, nothing would ever be the same after tonight. Kane chambered around in his Winchester and took position by the front window. In the distance he could see movement among the trees, shadows that didn't belong, shapes that meant violence. Was coming to his mountain sanctuary. "Here they come," he said quietly. The final battle for Sarah's future was about to begin. Sarah's father's rifle felt impossibly heavy in her small hands, but she gripped it with the same determination that had carried her through 2 years of loss and fear. Kane had positioned the Winchester where she could reach it from the root cellar, not because he wanted her to fight, but because he understood that desperate times demanded desperate preparations. The first shots came just after midnight, muzzle flashes lighting up the forest like deadly fireflies. Kane had been right about Crawford's tactics. The judge had surrounded the cabin with enough men to make escape impossible, or so he thought. "Sarah, down!" Kane barked as bullets shattered the cabin's front window. Sarah dropped into the root cellar as they'd practiced, but she didn't close the trapdoor completely. Through the narrow gap, she could see Kane and Eleanor moving between defensive positions, returning fire with calm precision. Frank Morrison's voice carried across the clearing from his position behind the woodshed. "Got 2 of them moving up the south ridge." Kane's military training showed in how he coordinated their defense. Hand signals directed Elena to the east window while he covered the main approach. Dr. Martinez's hunting rifle spoke from the north side of the cabin, followed by a cry of pain from the darkness. But Crawford had come prepared for a siege. Sarah could hear him calling orders to his men, his cultured voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Burn them out! Set fire to the back wall!" Through her crack in the floorboards, Sarah saw Elena's face go pale. Fire was their greatest fear. The cabin's log walls would burn like a torch once they caught, and there would be nowhere to run. Kane must have realized the same thing. "Frank," he shouted, "we need to move to the secondary position." "Can't!" Frank's reply came between rifle shots. "They got the trail covered." Sarah felt her heart pounding as she realized their carefully planned fallback to the mining camp had been anticipated and blocked. Crawford was smarter than they'd hoped and more ruthless than they'd feared. The smell of smoke began drifting into the cabin. "Elena, take Sarah and get to the north window," Kane ordered. "I'll provide cover." "Thomas, I'm not leaving you." "That's not a request." Kane's command voice brooked no argument. "Get her out of here!" Elena lifted the trapdoor, and Sarah climbed out clutching the Winchester. The rifle was almost as tall as she was, but she'd practiced with it enough to know how to handle the weight. "Can you carry it?" Elena whispered. Sarah nodded grimly. "Papa taught me." They made it to the north window just as the back wall of the cabin burst into flames. Dr. Martinez appeared out of the darkness, blood streaming from a graze on his forehead, but his eyes alert and determined. "There's a gap in their line about 50 yards north," he reported breathlessly. "If we can reach the creek bed, we might be able to work our way up to the old mining camp." Kane appeared beside them, his face grim in the firelight. "What about Frank and the others?" "Frank's pinned down behind the woodshed. Tommy's somewhere in the trees. Haven't seen him since the shooting started." As if summoned by his name, Tommy Kowalski materialized from the forest shadows. The 14-year-old's face was streaked with dirt and tears, but he carried his father's old Colt with steady hands. "My uncles are dead," he said simply. "Both of them. Crawford shot them when they tried to run." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Crawford was eliminating his own men to prevent them from testifying against him. The judge had moved beyond corruption into pure desperation. Kane made a quick tactical decision. "We go together. Elena, stay close to Sarah. Tommy, watch our backs. Doc, you and I will provide covering fire." They moved out through the north window as the cabin's roof began to catch fire. The flames provided unwanted illumination, making them visible targets as they crossed the open ground toward the creek bed. Crawford's voice rang out behind them. "There! The girls with them!" Suddenly, the night erupted in gunfire, focused entirely on their small group. Sarah felt Elena's hand on her back, pushing her toward the ground as bullets whined overhead. "Stay low," Kane commanded, his Winchester speaking rapidly as he tried to suppress the enemy fire. They made it to the creek bed just as Frank Morrison broke cover from behind the burning woodshed, running toward them with his rifle clutched across his chest. He made it 20 yards before Crawford's hired guns cut him down. Sarah watched the rancher fall and felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. Frank had died trying to protect her, just like her parents had died trying to protect their land. How many good people would Crawford destroy before someone stopped him? "This way!" Dr. Martinez led them upstream, using the creek bed for cover as they worked their way toward higher ground. Behind them, the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame. 2 years of Kane's careful solitude. All of Sarah's small possessions except the clothes on her back and her father's rifle. Everything gone in Crawford's desperate attempt to eliminate witnesses to his crimes, but Sarah found that she didn't care about the material losses. The only things that mattered were moving through the darkness beside her, Kane's steady presence, Elena's protective courage, Dr. Martinez's quiet competence, and even Tommy's frightened determination. They were her family now, and family was worth fighting for. The sound of pursuit followed them up the creek, boots splashing through water, men calling to each other as they tried to track their quarry in the darkness. "How much further to the mining camp?" Elena whispered. "Quarter mile," Kane replied. "But we need to reach it before they surround us again." As they climbed higher, Sarah began to recognize landmarks from her exploration of the mountain with Kane. The old mining camp sat on a shelf of rock that provided natural fortification, but it also offered limited escape routes if their position became untenable. "Papa Tom," Sarah said quietly as they paused to catch their breath. "What if we don't make it?" Kane looked down at her with eyes that held both love and fierce determination. "Then we make sure Crawford doesn't make it either." "Some fights are worth having, Sarah, even if you can't win them." Sarah nodded, understanding more than a 7-year-old should about the mathematics of sacrifice and the price of standing up to evil. Behind them, the pursuit was getting closer. Ahead lay the mining camp and whatever final stand they could make, against a corrupt judge who had already demonstrated he would kill anyone who threatened his criminal empire. Sarah hefted her father's rifle and followed. Kane up the mountain trail. She was James Hartwell's daughter and Margaret Crawford's legacy. She was Thomas Kane's adopted child and Elena Vasquez's student. Most importantly, she was a witness to crimes that demanded justice. and she would not go quietly into whatever darkness Crawford had planned for her. The mountain wind carried the scent of smoke and gunpowder as 5 survivors climbed toward their final refuge, pursued by men who served corruption and greed. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns that had witnessed countless human struggles between good and evil. Tonight, that ancient battle would be fought once again on a Montana mountainside, with the fate of one small girl standing for the future of justice itself. The original land deed lay folded in Sarah's coat pocket, its edges worn soft from handling, but its legal language still clear and binding. As dawn broke over the mining camp, casting long shadows across the abandoned workings, Sarah pulled out the document that would either save them all or die with them on this mountain. Kane had positioned their small group among the old mining structures, stone foundations and timber supports that provided cover while offering good fields of fire down the slope. Dr. Martinez tended a bullet wound in Tommy's shoulder, while Elena kept watch on the southern approach. Crawford's remaining men had spent the night surrounding their position, but the judge himself had stayed well back from the actual fighting. Now, as morning light revealed the tactical situation clearly, Sarah could see him standing beside a large pine tree about 200 yards down the slope, close enough to direct his men, far enough to avoid the risk of catching a stray bullet. "He's going to try to talk us into surrendering," Kane said, checking his ammunition. "They were running low, perhaps 20 rounds between all of them. Will you listen to him?" Elena asked. Kane's answer was interrupted by Crawford's voice, calling across the distance, amplified by the mountain acoustics. "Mr. Kane, I think we've shed enough blood over a simple misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Kane shouted back. "You murdered your own daughter. That's a serious accusation, one that requires proof in a court of law." Crawford's response carried the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to legal maneuvering. "I'm prepared to offer you and your companions safe passage out of the territory if you'll just hand over the child." Sarah felt Kane's protective instincts flare. "She stays with me." "The child belongs with family, Mr. Kane. Real family, not some mountain hermit with delusions of parenthood." The words hit Kane like physical blows, and Sarah could see them finding their mark. She'd noticed how Kane sometimes questioned his own worthiness as her father, how he worried that his violent past made him unsuitable to raise a child. Sarah stood up despite the danger, her small voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "My real family is dead," she called down the slope. "You killed them." The unexpected sound of a 7-year-old girl defying a territorial judge seemed to freeze everyone on the mountainside. Crawford's men stopped moving, their attention focused on the brave child who stood among the mining ruins like an avenging angel. "You are my granddaughter," Crawford replied, his voice taking on the honey-smooth tone that had fooled so many people over the years. "I know you've been told terrible lies about me, but blood is thicker than water, child. I can give you a proper home, education, everything a young lady deserves." Sarah felt the land deed crinkle in her pocket as she stepped forward, Kane's protective hand on her shoulder. "I already have everything I deserve," she said clearly. "A papa who chose me when nobody else wanted me. A teacher who believes I'm smart. Friends who care about me. You can't give me anything I don't already have." "I can give you justice for your parents' death," Crawford called back. "Help me find the real killers, and I promise you they'll hang for their crimes." The offer was smooth, plausible, exactly the kind of legal manipulation that had allowed Crawford to operate with impunity for years. But Sarah had learned to see through adult lies, and this one was particularly transparent. "You are the real killer," she said simply. Crawford's composure finally cracked. "You ungrateful little—" He caught himself, but not before revealing the rage that lurked beneath his civilized facade. "Mr. Kane, last chance! Send the girl down here or my men will come up and take her." Kane's response was to chamber a round in his Winchester. "Come ahead, Judge. We'll be waiting." The final assault began with Crawford's remaining men. Sarah counted 6 of them, advancing up the slope in a coordinated rush. Kane and Dr. Martinez met them with precise rifle fire. but their ammunition was running desperately low. Elena grabbed Tommy's pistol as the boy worked to reload his father's rifle one-handed. She'd never fired a weapon in anger before, but desperation and determination made up for inexperience. Sarah clutched her father's rifle, knowing she might have to use it despite Kane's instructions to stay hidden. As the attackers reached the outer perimeter of the mining camp, she could see individual faces, recognize the hunger for violence in their eyes. One of Crawford's men flanked wide to the east, trying to circle behind their position. Kane was too busy with the frontal assault to notice, and Dr. Martinez was reloading. Sarah made a decision that would have terrified her parents and filled them with pride in equal measure. She raised the Winchester, sighted carefully as Kane had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil knocked her backward, but her shot found its mark. The flanking gunman stumbled, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers as Sarah's bullet took him in the shoulder. "Sarah!" Kane's voice carried both admiration and terror. "Get down!" But Sarah's shot had done more than wound one attacker. It had demonstrated that their small group was prepared to fight to the end, that even the children among them would not surrender without resistance. Crawford's assault faltered as his men realized they weren't facing helpless victims, but determined defenders who would make every advance costly. "Fall back," Crawford ordered. "Regroup at the tree line." As his men retreated, Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the land deed, the document that proved her legal ownership of the property Crawford had killed her parents to acquire. "Judge Crawford," she called down the slope, "I have something that belongs to you." She held up the deed, letting the morning sunlight illuminate the official seals and legal language that made her one of the wealthiest landowners in Montana Territory. "This says the land is mine. The mineral rights, the water rights, everything. You killed Mom and Papa for nothing." The impact on Crawford was immediate and devastating. His carefully constructed criminal enterprise had been built on the assumption that Sarah was dead and her inheritance legally void. The existence of the original deed meant that every sale, every transfer, every development deal was fraudulent and could be challenged in federal court. "That document is a forgery," Crawford shouted, but his voice carried the desperation of a man whose world was collapsing. "Then come up here and prove it," Sarah replied with devastating 7-year-old logic. "If it's fake, you shouldn't be scared of it." Elena appeared beside Sarah, her teacher's instincts recognizing a teachable moment, even in the middle of a gun battle. "Sarah's right, Judge Crawford," Elena called down the slope. "If that deed is forged, you should be eager to examine it, unless you're afraid of what it might reveal about your other property acquisitions." The sound of approaching horses interrupted Crawford's response. Sarah looked east and saw riders approaching fast, men wearing federal badges and carrying military carbines. Elena's cousin had arrived with the full U.S. Marshal's posse, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the smoke from Kane's burned cabin. Crawford saw them too and realized his position had become untenable. His criminal empire was about to be exposed. His hired guns were either dead or wounded, and the key witness to his crimes was not only alive, but in possession of documents that could destroy him. He made the desperate decision of a cornered predator. Drawing his pistol, Crawford began climbing toward the mining camp himself, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "If I can't have the land, then nobody can," he snarled. "Starting with that ungrateful little brat?" Kane stepped in front of Sarah, his Winchester steady despite their desperate circumstances. "You'll have to go through me." "Judge," Crawford raised his pistol with the shaking hands of a man who had finally run out of legal tricks and political connections. "Then I will." The two men faced each other across the mining camp, the corrupt judge who had destroyed families for profit and the former soldier who had chosen love over safety. Between them stood all the questions about justice, family, and the price of doing what's right when the system fails. Sarah clutched the land deed that represented her parents' dreams and her own future, watching the final confrontation between the man who had killed her family and the man who had saved her life. The morning sun climbed higher over the Montana, peaks as federal marshals rode hard toward the mining camp, racing to prevent one last tragedy in a story that had already seen too much bloodshed. But sometimes justice requires a final reckoning between good and evil, and that moment had finally arrived on a mountainside where a brave little girl held the proof of crimes that demanded punishment. The family photograph sat in a place of honor on Elena's mantelpiece, showing three people who had chosen each other despite having no blood relation. Kane stood behind the seated figures, his weathered hands resting protectively on the shoulders of his wife and daughter. Elena wore her best dress and the silver cross that had carried them through their darkest hours. Sarah, now 9 years old, smiled with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved and protected. 2 years had passed since the confrontation at the mining camp. 2 years since Judge Crawford had raised his pistol toward Kane and found himself facing the business end of a federal marshal's carbine instead. The corrupt judge had surrendered rather than face certain death. But his confession had revealed a conspiracy that reached all the way to the territorial capital. 17 families had recovered stolen property. 4 federal appointees had been arrested. The mining company investors who had unknowingly participated in Crawford's fraud had established a fund to compensate victims' families. And Sarah Hartwell Kane, she'd kept both her birth name and her chosen name, had become one of the wealthiest young women in Montana Territory. More importantly, she'd become something Crawford had never imagined possible. Happy. "Are you ready for your big day?" Eleanor asked, adjusting the ribbon in Sarah's dark hair. "The territorial governor himself is coming to see you receive your commendation." Sarah made a face in the mirror. At 9, she was still small for her age, but her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen both the worst and best of human nature. "I wish they wouldn't make such a fuss," she said practically. "I just told the truth about what happened to Mama and Papa. That's what people are supposed to do." Kane appeared in the doorway, wearing the only suit he owned and looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Sometimes telling the truth takes more courage than most people have, sweetheart." The ceremony that afternoon drew people from across the territory. Federal Marshal Diego Vasquez, Elena's cousin, whose timely arrival had prevented the final tragedy, presented Sarah with an official commendation for her role in exposing territorial corruption. Dr. Martinez, now mayor of Millbrook, spoke about the importance of standing up to injustice. Even Tommy Kowalski, now 16 and apprenticed to the town's new honest sheriff, offered a few words about finding the courage to do what's right. But the most meaningful moment came when Frank Morrison's widow approached Sarah after the ceremony. "Frank would have been proud," Mrs. Morrison said simply, pressing a small object into Sarah's hand. "He always said some fights are worth having, even if you can't be sure you'll win." Sarah looked down at the gift, Frank's old cavalry button, polished bright and mounted on a simple silver chain. She fastened it around her neck, adding it to her mother's locket and the other small treasures that connected her to the people who had shaped her life. That evening, as the last visitors departed and the family settled into their comfortable routine, Kane found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. The mountain cabin was gone, replaced by a proper house in town where Sarah could attend school and Eleanor could teach. But the essentials remained the same. 3 people who had chosen to be family, despite having every reason to remain strangers. "Papa Tom," Sarah said, looking up from the book she was reading by the fireplace. "Do you ever miss living up in the mountains?" Kane considered the question seriously. He did sometimes miss the solitude, the simplicity of life, where the only complications were weather and wildlife. But then he looked at Elena grading papers at the kitchen table, at Sarah absorbed in her reading, at the evidence of family life scattered throughout their home, and he knew he wouldn't trade any of it. "I miss the quiet sometimes," he said honestly. "But I don't miss being alone." Sarah nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Miss Elena says being alone and being lonely are different things. Your Miss Elena is very wise. She's not just my Miss Elena anymore," Sarah pointed out with 9-year-old logic. "She's your Miss Elena too, and my mama, Kane felt the familiar warmth that came whenever Sarah casually referred to their chosen family structure. Elena had officially adopted Sarah after their marriage, making their legal bonds as strong as their emotional ones. Sarah was wealthy enough to choose any life she wanted, but she'd chosen to stay with the people who had risked everything to protect her. "Speaking of your mama," Kane said, "she has something she wants to discuss with both of us." Elena looked up from her papers with a smile that held secrets. "Actually, it's something we want to discuss with Sarah." Sarah marked her place in her book and gave them her full attention. At 9, she'd learned to recognize when adults were working up to important announcements. "We've been thinking," Eleanor began, "about ways to use your inheritance that would honor your birth parents' memory." Kane pulled out a folder of documents they'd been working on for months. "What would you think about starting a school? A place where children who've lost their families could get an education and learn skills to protect themselves." Sarah's eyes grew wide as she studied the plans. The proposed school would serve orphans and vulnerable children throughout the territory, providing not just education, but practical skills in self-defense, wilderness survival, and legal rights. It would be staffed by people who understood trauma and resilience. "We'd call it the Hartwell Academy," Eleanor added. "Your parents believed in education and justice." This would be a way to continue their work. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. Finally, she looked up with the smile that had become her trademark, part innocence, part hard-won wisdom. "I think Mama and Papa would like that," she said simply. "When can we start?" Kane felt his heart swell with pride. At 9 years old, Sarah had already learned the most important lesson of all, that the best way to honor those you've lost is to help those who still need protecting. "We start tomorrow," he said, pulling both his girls into a fierce hug. "We start building something that will last long after we're gone." Outside, snow was beginning to fall on the Montana landscape, blanketing the mountains where their story had begun. But inside their warm home, 3 people who had found each other against impossible odds were planning a future that would help countless other children find safety, education, and hope. The photograph on Elena's mantelpiece seemed to smile in the firelight, capturing a moment when love had triumphed over corruption, when choosing family over fear had led to justice for all. And in the years to come, the Hartwell Academy would stand as testament to a simple truth that Thomas Kane had learned from a 7-year-old girl with button-eyed doll. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we choose love over logic. When we point to the child nobody else wants and say, that one is mine." The story that began with an unwanted orphan and a reluctant mountain man had become a legacy that would protect and educate children for generations to come. Sarah's parents had died defending their family's land, but their daughter had used that same land to create something even more valuable, a place where other children could learn that being unwanted didn't mean being unloved, and that sometimes the most unlikely families are the strongest ones of all.